Picture this. It's 1692, a small, isolated village in colonial America. A shadow falls over the community, and suddenly it begins to turn on itself. This whole thing was fueled by fear, by superstition, and by this absolute certainty that evil was walking among them. This is the story of the Salem witch trials, a truly chilling chapter in American history that started with whispers and ended at the gallows. 20. Let that number sink in for a second. That's how many people were killed as a direct result of the Salem witch trials. 19 of them were hanged, and one poor elderly man was actually pressed to death under heavy stones. And that doesn't even count the people who died in the absolutely awful conditions of the prisons. For a tiny little community, that was a staggering death toll. But what makes it truly shocking is just how weird it was for the time. And this right here is what makes the Salem story so completely mind-boggling. Before 1692, witchcraft accusations in the American colonies were pretty rare, and they almost never ended with an execution. Generally, the courts were skeptical. People were usually let go or, at worst, kicked out of town. But Salem? Oh, Salem was something else entirely. We're talking about 200 people accused, 20 executed. This wasn't just a trial, it was a full-blown lethal wave of mass hysteria. And that brings us to the central mystery we're going to unravel here. Why Salem? Why this one particular village? What was the perfect storm of factors that turned neighbors into accusers and judges into executioners? Okay, so let's dive into this. To really understand what went so horribly wrong in Salem, we first need to get a feel for just how different, how much more rational, really, the rest of the colonies could be when they were faced with accusations of magic. You gotta love this. This quote just brilliantly shows the typical attitude. It comes from a witchcraft trial down in Pennsylvania, a trial that was actually attended by its founder, William Penn. So when this terrified woman confessed to flying on a broomstick, what did the judge do? He basically said, well, there's no law against it, so you're free to go. That's the kind of level-headed skepticism that was the norm in most colonies, but not in Salem. So if the rest of the colonies were keeping their cool, what made Salem so different? Well, to get that, we have to step into their world, the worlds of the Puritans, living on the very edge of a continent. Their reality was built on isolation, hardship, and an incredibly intense religious belief. You have to understand, the people of Salem were living under this constant, crushing anxiety. All around them was what they called the Devil's Wilderness, this huge, unknown forest. They were dealing with violent conflicts with Native American tribes, political chaos coming from London, and these horrible smallpox epidemics that would just sweep through them. And then, layered on top of all of that, was this absolute, rock-solid belief that the devil wasn't just some idea. He was a real, physical enemy trying to destroy them. Historian Stacy Schiff just nails this psychological atmosphere with this quote. I mean, think about it. In these little isolated towns, in these dark and smoky houses, fear and imagination could just run wild. It was a world that was totally primed for paranoia, where every little shadow could be hiding a supernatural threat. And this right here is the crucial point, their worldview. For the Puritans, the Bible wasn't a collection of stories. It was literal, historical fact. They saw themselves as God's soldiers fighting a daily war against Satan. They truly believed they had carved this holy society out of a land that was once ruled by the devil. And the threat of witchcraft? Well, that was the threat of losing that war completely. And into this tense, fearful world came a spark. And it all started in the home of the village pastor, right in the middle of the bleak winter of 1692. So, it began with two young girls, the pastor's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail. They started having these violent, bizarre fits, screaming, twisting their bodies. A doctor came, couldn't find any physical cause, and so he made a diagnosis that would change everything. The girls were under an evil hand. They were bewitched. And then, under pressure, the girls started naming names. So who were these first witches? Well, take a look. A homeless woman who begged for food, a sickly woman who hadn't been to church in a year, and an enslaved woman from the Caribbean named Tituba. See a pattern here? They were the most marginalized, the most powerless people in the entire village. They were the easiest targets. And from those first 3 accusations, the spark ignited a firestorm. The legal hearings that followed just spiraled into this total spectacle of fear, confession, and these wild theatrical performances that sealed the fates of the accused. Okay, so the first 2 women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, they denied everything. But Tituba, She confessed, and her confession was absolutely explosive. She didn't just say, "Yeah, I did it." She told the judges this wild story about a whole conspiracy of witches serving the devil right there in Salem. This was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It confirmed everyone's worst fears and just blew the floodgates wide open for more accusations. The courtrooms themselves became a stage for all this hysteria. Just imagine, whenever an accused person tried to speak up and defend themselves, this whole group of afflicted girls would put on a terrifying show. They'd scream, they'd fall on the floor and convulse, and they'd claim that the defendant's spirit was physically attacking them in that very moment. It was dramatic, it was convincing, and, well, how do you disprove that? To make this all feel a bit more real, let's look at the tragic case of Martha Carrier. A neighbor's cows died after he got into an argument with her, and boom, suddenly she's a witch. The afflicted girls had fits just looking at her. And then, in the most horrifying twist, her own children were pressured into testifying against her, saying she had taught them witchcraft. She was hanged, a victim of a neighborhood dispute that turned deadly. And this brings us to the completely twisted, paradoxical logic that drove these trials and made them so lethal. The court created a perfect trap, a system where there was literally no innocent way out. This was the impossible choice everyone faced. If you were accused of witchcraft, you had two options. 1. Deny it. Maintain your innocence. If you did that, you would be tried, found guilty based on so-called spectral evidence, and then hanged. Or 2. You could confess to a crime you didn't commit. If you did that, your life would be spared, but you had to prove you were truly sorry by naming other witches. You had to feed more victims into the machine. Pleading innocence was a death sentence. But one man, an 80-year-old farmer named Giles Corey, he saw this insane trap for what it was, and he refused to play the game. He wouldn't enter a plea, not guilty, not innocent, and the legal punishment for that was just horrific, pressing. He was laid on the ground, and heavy stones were slowly piled on his chest for 2 days until he was crushed to death. He chose that agonizing end rather than give their broken system any legitimacy. Now, a fire that burns that hot can't last forever. By the fall of 1692, the accusations were getting out of hand. Too many respectable people were being named. Educated leaders from outside Salem started to call out the whole process, especially the reliance on spectral evidence. So, how did it all end? And what did America learn from it? The final numbers really tell the story. Around 200 people accused, 20 executed. Finally, in early 1693, the governor stepped in, he dissolved the special court, and the remaining 49 prisoners were eventually let go. The fever had broken, but the damage was permanent and profound. And this timeline, this just shows you how long the shadow of injustice can really be. The trials ended in 1693. Some families got financial compensation in 1711. But it wasn't until 1954, that's almost 300 years later, that the state of Massachusetts formally cleared the names of the last of the victims. 300 years to fully right a wrong. Believe it or not, something powerful and lasting did come out of all this horror. The shame of what happened in Salem severely weakened the authority of the Puritan Church. It served as this brutal, unforgettable lesson on the dangers of mixing state power with religious dogma. And it really pushed America down that long road toward the separation of church and state. You know, a pastor who watched the whole crisis unfold later wrote that complete rightness can give birth to complete evil. The people of Salem were so certain they were doing God's work, and that absolute certainty led them to commit terrible evil. And it leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from 1692 to right now. How do we guard against our own certainties?